Matteo had been living in that house for 2 months, and it still didn't feel like his. The kitchen was the worst part. Half the cabinet doors were hanging wrong. One of them didn't close at all. It just sat there, crooked, like it was tired. The countertop had a crack running down one side. The shelves someone had put up years ago were already pulling away from the wall. Every time he walked in there to make coffee, he felt like he'd walked into someone else's mess. Which, in a way, he had. He'd bought the brownstone right after the divorce came through, not because he'd always wanted to live in Delfshaven, or because the neighborhood was charming, or because the light through the front windows was golden in the afternoons, though all of that was true. He bought it because he needed to be somewhere that was only his. No shared history, no furniture that used to mean something, just walls. His walls. The problem was, the walls needed work, a lot of it, and Matteo was the kind of man who could charm anyone in a meeting room and couldn't hang a shelf straight to save his life. So he posted a job listing. Kitchen renovation, full gut, full rebuild. He needed someone who knew what they were doing. He did not expect Lieselot. She knocked on the door on a gray November morning. Right on time. He opened it and, he's admitted this himself, looking back, he did a thing with his face. A small recalibration. The kind you do when what shows up is different from what you had pictured in your head. Lieselot van den Berg was in her mid-30s, broad-shouldered, with pale blonde hair twisted into a bun held in place by an actual pencil. She had sawdust on her jacket collar before she'd even stepped inside. Her handshake was the kind that tells you something about a person immediately. She didn't wait for him to give her a tour. She walked in, looked at the kitchen, and started measuring. Matteo stood in the doorway and watched her pull out a tape measure and crouch down to check the base of the cabinet frames like she'd been doing this her whole life. Because she had. He made coffee. She didn't touch it. He made more coffee. She wrote numbers in a small notebook. After about 20 minutes, she straightened up, looked around the room one more time, and gave him a quote. It was fair. Actually, it was more than fair. He'd looked at enough listings to know she wasn't overcharging. "Can I ask?" he said, and then paused in a way that lasted just a beat too long. "You work alone?" She looked at him. "For jobs this size, yes." "Right." He nodded, tried to sound casual. "And the heavy panels? The upper cabinet sections? You'll be okay with those on your own?" Lieselot set her pencil down on the counter. She turned and looked at him with the kind of patience that isn't quite patience, more like a person deciding how much energy this moment deserves. "I built a barn in Friesland at 22, she said. "Alone. In February." She picked up her pencil. He drank his coffee and said nothing, which was the most honest thing he'd managed in months. She started the following Monday. He'd cleared out what he could over the weekend, pulled the old plates and mismatched cups out of the drooping shelves, stacked them in boxes in the hallway. The kitchen looked even worse empty, like a room that had given up. Lieselot arrived at 7:45 in the morning, with a work van and a playlist he could faintly hear through her earbuds. She didn't make small talk. She assessed, then she began. There is a particular kind of confidence that has nothing to do with noise. No announcements. No explaining what she was about to do before she did it. She just worked. Methodically. With a focus that made the room feel different just by her being in it. Matteo worked from home 2 days that first week. He sat at his desk in the next room and tried to concentrate on emails while the sounds of deconstruction came through the wall. The careful pulling apart of things that had been put together badly. The testing of what was worth keeping and what wasn't. At some point that first afternoon, he brought her a glass of water and left it on the counter beside her without saying anything, because he'd learned already that interrupting her while she was measuring something was not a good idea. She drank it without breaking her focus. He went back to his desk and found, to his mild surprise, that he wasn't bothered by the noise at all. By the end of the first week, 3 things had happened. The old cabinets were fully removed. The walls behind them, exposed for the first time in what looked like decades, were in better shape than he'd feared. And Matteo had been corrected twice. Once about the type of wood she was planning to use, and once about something he'd pointed to and called the support beam thing in the corner, which was not a support beam, and she explained what it actually was in a single sentence with no condescension, and somehow that made it worse. He found himself being more careful about what he said before he said it. He didn't mind that either. There is a specific kind of uncomfortable that comes from watching someone be extremely good at something you cannot do at all. Matteo had built a career on communication, on reading a room, on finding the right words at the right moment, on making people feel understood. He was good at his job, he knew that. But Liselott moved through that ruined kitchen like she understood it in a language he didn't speak. She'd look at a wall and see what it needed. She'd run a hand along a frame and know without a ruler whether it was true. She had a relationship with wood that was almost conversational. She'd press a cabinet panel and tilt her head slightly, like she was listening. He watched this from the doorway one morning, coffee in hand, and felt something he hadn't expected. Not attraction. Not yet. Just respect. Clean and uncomplicated. The kind you have for someone who is simply, undeniably good at what they do. He thought about the way he'd paused when she showed up, the way his face had done that thing. He felt, with some precision, like an idiot. On Friday of the first week, she packed up her tools at exactly 5 o'clock, confirmed the plan for Monday, and left. Matteo stood in the empty shell of his kitchen and looked at where the old cabinets used to be. The walls were bare and clean. You could see the bones of the room, the actual structure, underneath all the things that had been built over it badly. He hadn't seen the room look like this since before he moved in. It looked, for the first time, like something. Like a room waiting to become what it was supposed to be. He wasn't entirely sure he was only thinking about the kitchen. By the third week, Matteo had learned a few things about Liselott. She arrived at 7:45 every single morning. Not 7:43. Not 7:50. 7:45. Like she had an agreement with time itself. She drank black coffee only in the mornings and switched to water after noon. She didn't talk while she was measuring or cutting, but she would talk freely while she was sanding. Something about the repetition of it, maybe, that left part of her mind free. She had opinions about wood the way certain people have opinions about wine. Not showing off, just knowing things deeply and saying them plainly. He'd also learned that she noticed everything, not in an intrusive way. She didn't comment on the stack of unopened mail on the hallway table or the fact that the living room still had nothing on the walls. She just saw. And sometimes, quietly, she did something about it. It started on a Tuesday in the third week. She'd finished laying the base framework for the lower cabinets earlier than expected. The adhesive needed a few hours to cure properly before she could move to the next stage, so she had time. She could have sat in her van and eaten lunch. She could have left early. Instead, Matteo came home that evening. He'd been at a client meeting across the city and found 3 things different about his house. The kitchen door, which had been dragging along the floor every single time it opened, swung clean. The latch on the small window above the hallway had been stiff since he moved in. He'd been pushing it open with his shoulder every morning. It opened smoothly now with one finger. And the third step on the staircase, the one that dipped slightly on the left side and made a sound like a muffled complaint every time he stepped on it, was solid, quiet, fixed. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and stepped on it twice. Nothing. Just a stair. He stood there for a moment, not entirely sure what to do with the feeling that came up. He didn't mention it the next morning. She didn't bring it up either. But when he handed her the morning coffee, she had started accepting it by the second week. She looked at him for just a second in a way that said, "Yes, that was me. And no, it doesn't require a conversation." So they didn't have one. What they did start having, slowly, was something else. It began with wood. She was working on the upper cabinet frames one afternoon, fitting the joints, testing the angles, and he walked in and asked, genuinely curious, why she'd chosen oak for the shelving when the sample board she'd shown him earlier had included 3 other options. She looked at him to check if it was a real question. It was, so she told him. About grain density. about how oak responds to humidity over years in a way that cheaper wood doesn't, about how a kitchen gets steam and grease and temperature changes every single day, and the wood either holds up to that, or it slowly, quietly fails, about how the right material isn't always the most beautiful one in the showroom, it's the one that's still good in 15 years. He listened to all of it. "You went to school for this?" he asked. "Art school, first." She fitted a joint as she talked. "Sculpture. Then I switched." "Why?" She thought about it for a second. "Sculpture and joinery are the same argument. You're just figuring out what a material wants to be. Joinery pays better." He laughed. She didn't. Quite. But the corner of her mouth moved. After that, the conversations happened more naturally. Not every day. She still had hours where the work required full concentration, and he'd learned to read those and leave her alone. But in the margins, while the adhesive cured, while she waited for a measurement to confirm, they talked. She grew up outside Groningen, in a village small enough that everyone knew which family you came from just by looking at your face. Her father was a carpenter. Her uncle was a carpenter. She'd grown up in workshops the way some kids grow up in kitchens. It was just the air of the house. She went to art school in Amsterdam because she wanted to do something different, and then found out that different still led her back to wood. She had a cat named after a Dutch naval admiral, which he found genuinely funny. "De Ruyter," she said, completely seriously. He was brave and he didn't make a fuss. Seemed right. Matteo told her about his work, communications consulting, which she received with a polite nod that told him she found it slightly abstract. And then, without planning to, he told her about the divorce. Not the details, just the shape of it. That it had been 2 years of slow quietness before it ended. That they'd been good at being a couple in public and running out of things to say in private. That the house he was in now felt, some mornings, like wearing shoes that weren't quite broken in yet. Lieselot sanded a cabinet edge while he said this. She didn't stop working, which somehow made it easier to keep talking. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said it. "People say things like that to make leaving feel like maintenance." He stopped. "What?" "When someone tells you, you have a broken sense of this, you're not good at that. It's easier to leave something you've already decided is damaged. You say it enough, you start to believe you're not leaving a person. You're just walking away from something that wasn't working." She kept sanding. "It's not a diagnosis," she added, "just a pattern." He didn't answer. He poured himself a second coffee and stood there for a moment, looking at the cabinet frames she'd built. Clean, level, fitted perfectly into the corners of the room. He filed that sentence away somewhere he'd find it at 2 a.m. What he didn't say, and only understood much later, was that something had shifted in those 3 weeks in a way that had nothing to do with the kitchen. He had spent 2 years in a marriage learning to manage what he said, to smooth things, to find the version of himself that caused the least friction. He'd gotten very good at it. So good that after a while he couldn't entirely remember what he thought about things before he'd run them through that filter first. Lieselot didn't create that problem. With her, he kept finding himself saying the actual thing, not the polished version, not the version that would land well, just the thing. He didn't know what to do with that. He wasn't sure he had to do anything with it yet. The kitchen was taking shape by the end of week 3. The frames were up. The oak panels she'd chosen were stacked against the wall, waiting. The room still looked unfinished. Bare bones. No doors yet. Wires still visible where the fixtures would go. But there was a structure to it now that hadn't been there before. A logic. You could walk in and see what it was going to be. He stood in it one evening after she'd left, and did exactly that. Looked at the frame of it, tried to picture the finished version. He thought about what she'd said. Sculpture and joinery are the same argument. You're just figuring out what a material wants to be. He thought, in a way he didn't examine too closely, that this might apply to things beyond wood. On Friday, before she left, she paused in the hallway and looked at the staircase. Ran her eye up it. Not checking her own work, just looking. "The banister's going to need attention eventually," she said. "Not urgent. Just, don't ignore it too long." "I won't," he said. She nodded, picked up her bag. "Monday," she said. "Monday," he said. She left. He stood in his almost kitchen, in his almost home, with the stair that didn't creak anymore, and the window that opened without a fight, and the door that swung exactly as it should. And he thought about what it meant, that someone who'd had time to sit in her van had instead walked around his house looking for things that needed to be made right. He didn't have a word for it yet, but it sat with him all weekend. By week 6, the kitchen was almost finished, and Matteo had run out of reasons to pretend he wasn't paying attention. The oak cabinets were up. The shelving fit the awkward corner alcove that 3 people before her had told him was unusable. She'd looked at it for 4 minutes the first week and said, "No, it's fine. We just have to think about it differently." She'd built something custom for that space. It was, honestly, the best part of the room. The countertop was in. The fixtures were in. The lighting, which she'd helped him decide on after he'd spent 45 minutes going back and forth between 2 options that she told him, flatly, were nearly identical. That was in too. The kitchen looked like a kitchen. A real one. One that belonged to someone who lived there on purpose. He kept finding himself standing in the doorway just looking at it. On a Thursday evening in week 6, he asked if she wanted to stay for dinner. He said it the way people say things they've been thinking about for a while, but are trying to make sound casual. She heard the effort. She noticed most things. She said yes. This was unexpected. Not because she was unfriendly. She wasn't. But in 6 weeks she had never stayed past 5 o'clock. Never accepted anything beyond the morning coffee and water through the day. Never lingered. She had very clear lines around her work, and she stood on the professional side of them without making a production of it. So when she said yes, she said it simply, set down her sanding block, and washed her hands at the sink she'd helped him pick out. The dinner was not impressive. Matteo could talk about food with some authority. He had opinions about it, knew what things were supposed to taste like, could navigate a good restaurant menu without embarrassing himself. Actually cooking it was a different matter. He made pasta. It was slightly overcooked. The sauce was decent, jarred, which he admitted to without being asked. The salad was fine. She ate without complaint, and without the particular careful politeness that people use when food is bad, and they're too kind to say so. She just ate, like it was dinner and she was hungry, and that was the whole story. "You don't cook much," she said. Not a question. "I cook," he said, "just not well. Different things." "I'm aware." She almost smiled. "The sauce is fine. It's from a jar. I know. It's still fine." After dinner, she didn't immediately reach for her coat. He didn't immediately hand it to her. They ended up at the kitchen table with the leftover wine, and somehow the conversation moved from the renovation, which had occupied all their previous conversations as a kind of neutral ground, into other territory. She told him about a difficult job she'd had 2 years ago, a client who'd changed the design 4 times mid-build, and then complained about the timeline. She talked about it without anger, just with the particular weariness of someone who has dealt with people long enough to find them mostly predictable. "What did you do?" he asked. "Finished the job, charged what was fair, didn't take another referral from him." "That's it?" "That's it." She looked at him. "What else is there?" He thought about all the things he would have done. The emails he would have written, the conversations he would have had, the energy he would have spent managing the situation, managing the client, managing his own frustration about it. "I would have made it complicated," he said honestly. "Most people do." Somewhere after the second glass of wine, he found a deck of cards. This was, it turned out, a mistake, or the best decision of the evening, depending on how you looked at it. They were both, it emerged within about 4 minutes, catastrophically competitive at cards. Not loudly, not with table slapping or dramatic reactions. The competitiveness was quiet and completely obvious. Liselott played with the same focused attention she brought to measuring a joint, reading the situation, thinking 2 steps ahead, not giving anything away. Matteo played the way he managed negotiations at work, watching for patterns, adjusting, trying to read the other person. They were very evenly matched, which made it worse. She won the first game. He asked for another. She agreed, in the way someone agrees to something they were already planning on winning. She won that one too. "Best of 5, he said. She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. She won 3 of the 5. She was not gracious about it. She didn't gloat. She wasn't that kind of person. But there was a stillness in the way she set down her final hand that was somehow worse than gloating. He laughed. Genuinely. Loudly. In a way that surprised him slightly. The kind of laugh that comes out before you've decided to let it. He hadn't laughed like that in over a year. He knew that in the moment. It landed somewhere in him and stayed there. Liselott had a rule. She'd had it for a long time. Since a job about 5 years back, a renovation for a couple who turned out to be separating midway through the project, and she'd become, without meaning to, the person that one of them talked to every day. Not romantically, just the only steady, neutral presence in a house that was fracturing. When the job ended, she'd lost the friendship along with the contract, and it had cost her more than she expected. After that, she'd drawn a line. Clients were clients. The work was the work. She was good at her job. She was fair. She showed up on time and she did what she said she'd do. That was the whole arrangement. She'd kept that line for 5 years. She was aware, sitting at Mateo's kitchen table in the kitchen she'd built, that she was currently on the wrong side of it. She wasn't panicking about it. She was just aware. What she'd noticed, and she noticed things the way she measured things, precisely and without drama, was that he didn't try to charm her. She had seen him on the phone with his clients. She'd overheard enough to know that he had a whole version of himself he could turn on for a room. Easy, warm, a little funny. All of it practiced and smooth. It worked. She could hear it working through walls. He didn't use it on her. He said the wrong thing sometimes. He didn't always know what to do with a silence. He'd admitted to being bad at cooking, bad at DIY, bad at making decisions about lighting fixtures, in the same plain way she might note a measurement that wasn't quite right. She didn't know if he was being careful, or if this was just what he was like, one layer under the professional version. Either way, she'd noticed. He walked her to the door just before 10 o'clock. The hallway was quiet. The house had that particular feeling of an evening that's gone well, and is now ending, which is its own specific kind of moment. "The kitchen is almost done," she said. "I know." A pause. "It's good work," she said. And she meant it. She was proud of that room. She built things she was proud of. It wasn't nothing. "I know that too." He looked at her. Paused just a second too long. "I meant, thank you for the other parts. The door, the stairs, the conversations." He said it without the charm, without the smooth version. Just said it. She stood in the doorway. The space between what she said next and what she could have said next was the size of a doorway. "Good night, Mateo," she said. She meant something else. He heard it. She knew he heard it. Neither of them stepped through. She walked to her van. She sat in the driver's seat. She did not start the engine for 4 minutes. She counted. The kitchen was finished on a Wednesday. Liselott did a final check. Ran her hands along every surface. Opened every cabinet door. Tested every hinge. Crouched to look at the base joints at the angle where flaws show. It took about 20 minutes. She found 2 things that weren't quite right. Fixed them in another 15. And then stood in the middle of the room and looked at it as a whole. Mateo stood in the doorway and watched her do this. There was something private about it. The way she looked at her own work. Not prideful exactly. More like a quiet conversation with the room. A final check of something she'd been responsible for. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. He paid her that afternoon. The full amount, which was fair, which they'd both known it would be from the beginning. She gave him a proper invoice, shook his hand, that same firm, informative handshake from the first day, and said if anything needed attention in the first 6 months, he should let her know. Professional, clean, correct. She drove away and the house was, for the first time in 6 weeks, completely quiet. He made dinner in the finished kitchen that night. It was, as usual, mediocre. He overcooked the vegetables slightly and the timing was off. Everything ready at slightly different moments, so the whole meal had a scrambled quality. He ate standing at the counter because the kitchen table still felt new and he hadn't quite settled into the habit of using it. The room looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. The oak had a warmth to it in the evening light that she'd told him it would. He'd asked if it would look different at night, and she'd said, "Yes, warmer, you'll like it." She'd been right. The shelving in the corner alcove held his things neatly. His coffee cups on the shelf she'd designed at exactly the right height. He ate his slightly wrong dinner in the kitchen that was exactly right, and felt the specific kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, the kind that has a shape. He didn't contact her for 10 days. This was deliberate. Or he told himself it was deliberate. A choice, a decision to let the professional end of things settle properly. To not be the client who doesn't know when the job is over. He was not entirely honest with himself about this. What he was actually doing, he would have admitted if pressed, was trying to figure out what he would say, and arriving at nothing. He knew how to communicate. It was what he did, professionally, every day. He could write an email that landed exactly the way he intended. He could find the right words for almost any professional situation. Every time he opened his laptop to write to her, he found himself in a situation that didn't seem to have right words, just real ones. And he was out of practice with those, so he didn't write. Not yet. He cooked in the kitchen every night. Not well, but every night, which was new. Previously he'd mostly been eating at his desk or ordering in, drifting through the half-finished house without much routine. Now he came home, went into the kitchen, and made something. The results were inconsistent. He burned rice on Thursday. On Sunday he made something with eggs and whatever vegetables were in the refrigerator that was actually decent. He stood there a bit surprised when he tasted it. He started using the corner shelving the way she'd intended it to be used. Organized his things. Found a rhythm for the space. He noticed when the afternoon light hit the counter the way she'd said it would. He noticed the cabinet doors, the way they all closed correctly and held. Every morning when he made coffee, the cup went on the shelf at the right height, and the whole thing worked the way it was supposed to work. He thought about her almost every time. He didn't examine that too closely. He found a reason on the 11th day. One of the shelf brackets in the kitchen, the one in the far corner, which she'd mentioned during the last week might need checking once the wood had settled. He looked at it carefully, and decided it needed to be looked at by someone who knew what they were looking at. He was aware that this was not entirely about the bracket. He texted instead of calling, because he had learned that she was a person who preferred things clear and in writing, over things that required immediate responses to tone. He said he thought the bracket she'd mentioned might be worth checking when she had a chance. No urgency. She replied within an hour. Complete sentences. Properly punctuated. He had learned to read this from her. She texted the way she talked, without extra words. But she didn't abbreviate or trail off. If she sent you a complete sentence, it meant she'd read your message carefully and given it a proper answer. She said she could come by early the following week. He said that worked. She said Monday at 8. He said perfect. And that was the exchange. Brief. Practical. Entirely correct. He read it 3 more times than it required. She took the job in Utrecht. It was a big one. A full commercial fit-out for a studio space. 6 weeks of work. The kind of contract that was good for business and required full concentration. She said yes to it the week after Delfshaven ended. She worked hard. Long days. Good work. She was proud of what she was putting together. She didn't think about Matteo. She thought about him. Not constantly. Not in a way that disrupted her focus on the job, but in the margins. On the drive in the mornings. Or in the quiet while the adhesive cured. The way you find yourself thinking about a conversation that hasn't finished yet. She thought about the way he laughed that one evening. The unplanned kind. She thought about the way he'd said thank you for the other parts, and meant it without decoration. She thought about the fact that when she'd fixed his door and his stair and his window latch, she hadn't done it for him. She'd done it because she couldn't be in a house with things that were broken and not fix them. That was just how she was. But he was the house. She caught herself thinking that, and then spent a few minutes being annoyed about it, which didn't change anything. She came by on Monday morning. The bracket was fine. She checked it in about 4 minutes. The wood had settled exactly as expected and everything was holding correctly. She told him this. He said he'd thought so but wanted to be sure. There was a pause that lasted a few seconds longer than the situation required. He'd made coffee. She accepted it. They stood in the kitchen. His kitchen. The one she'd built. and drank coffee, and talked about nothing important for about 20 minutes. Her project in Utrecht. A problem he'd had with a presentation at work. The cat named De Ruyter, who had recently decided that sleeping on her drafting table was acceptable. It felt completely normal. It felt completely strange. When she left, she sat in her van, and didn't count this time. She just drove. But that evening she was thinking about something she'd noticed when she walked in that morning. His kitchen, after 3 weeks of him actually using it, had a certain look to it. Organized, but used. The coffee cups on the right shelf. A small plant on the counter that hadn't been there before. A cutting board propped up at the side because he used it every day. It looked like someone's home. She had built a lot of kitchens. Watched the before and after, the empty room and the lived-in room. It always looked different with someone in it properly. She'd built that one to last. She knew it would. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. She was on a scaffold in Utrecht, 2 weeks after the bracket visit, and her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She checked it at the same time that she checked messages. Carefully, in a break. It was from Matteo. He'd been at a museum that weekend, he wrote. There was an exhibition on traditional joinery. Dutch techniques, historical tools, the kind of work she'd mentioned once in passing. He'd gone, he said, because he was curious after everything she'd told him about the field. And then, at the end of the email, plainly, he said he'd like to go again. With her. If she had any interest. He said it without the built-up version, without the carefully managed phrasing. Just, I thought of you. I'd like to see you. Here's a reason that isn't an excuse. She read it standing on a scaffold in Utrecht with sawdust in her hair. She read it 3 times. She replied on Thursday. He had checked his email 40 times before that. She didn't know that. Or maybe she did. She noticed most things. She said she knew the exhibition. She said yes. The exhibition was in Amsterdam, at a small museum near the Jordaan district that Matteo had found by accident while looking for something else entirely. He'd walked past it on a Saturday afternoon, seen a poster in the window about traditional Dutch joinery, and stopped. Stood outside for a moment, thought about the way Lieselot had talked about mortise and tenon joints that one afternoon in week 4, hands moving as she explained it, and how he'd understood about 30% of the technical part and 100% of the fact that she loved what she did. He bought a ticket, walked through the whole thing alone, and then wrote her an email. He'd drafted it 4 times. The first 3 were too careful. The 4th one he sent without rereading, because he knew if he read it again he'd sand all the honest parts out of it. When she said yes, he went back to the museum website and looked at the exhibition hours for the following weekend. He felt, he admitted to himself, like a man who had no idea what he was doing. This was, for someone who professionally understood how to manage situations, more uncomfortable than it sounds. They met outside the museum on a Saturday morning. It was early December by then. Cold, but not brutal. The particular Dutch winter cold that sits in the air cleanly, rather than biting. She was already there when he arrived, standing with her hands in her jacket pockets, looking at a plaque on the building exterior. "You're 2 minutes early," she said without looking up. "You're 5 minutes early," he said. She looked at him then. "I'm always early." "I know." They went inside. The exhibition was not large. 2 rooms, about 40 pieces. Historic tools, examples of traditional joinery work, restored furniture panels that showed the techniques. Some of it was behind glass. Some of it was on open display with small signs asking visitors to handle it carefully. Lieselot picked up one of the display pieces, a small demonstration panel showing a dovetail joint, and turned it over in her hands like it was a normal thing to do. Matteo watched her. She talked as she looked. Not for his benefit exactly, more the way someone thinks out loud when they're genuinely engaged. About the spacing of the dovetails on the panel. About how a machine cut and a hand cut were almost identical to the eye but different in the hand. There was a slight irregularity to handwork that machine cutting couldn't replicate. About how some furniture built 300 years ago was still holding together without glue or screws. Just friction, she said. Correctly shaped wood, pressed correctly together. Friction and fit. That's it. That's it. She set the panel down carefully. Everything else is just decoration. He looked at the panel. He thought about what she'd said for the rest of the morning. They walked the 2 rooms slowly. She explained things when there was something to explain, and didn't fill the silence when there wasn't. He asked questions. Some of them were good questions. A couple weren't, and she told him plainly when they weren't, which he'd gotten used to and had come to prefer to politeness. At one point she stopped in front of a restored cabinet. 17th century, the card said, Dutch provincial, and stood there for a long moment just looking at it. Someone built this in a cold workshop, she said. Probably in winter, with hand tools, and it's still here. He looked at it. That's a long time to be useful, he said. She nodded slowly. It's a long time to hold together. They stood there for a moment in the same quiet. They had lunch after at a small place nearby. It was easy in a way that neither of them commented on, because commenting on it would have made it smaller. They talked about the exhibition, about her project in Utrecht, which was in its final 2 weeks, about a bad professional decision he'd made earlier in the year that he hadn't told anyone about, which he mentioned sideways and then told her the whole thing, linearly, because halfway through he stopped trying to make it sound better than it was. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "What would you do differently?" Not, "It's not that bad." Not, "Don't be hard on yourself." Just, "What would you do differently?" He thought about it honestly and told her. She nodded. "Then you know what to do if it comes up again." He looked at her. "That's it?" he said. "That's it." She picked up her coffee. "What else is there?" He recognized the phrase from before. He smiled. She noticed. They walked along the canal after lunch, because neither of them was ready to end the afternoon, and neither of them said that either. They just didn't move toward the train station. It was colder now, the light already going gray in the way December afternoons do. The canal water was still. The city had the specific quiet of a Saturday, when the morning rush has gone and the evening hasn't started yet. He had been thinking, for most of the afternoon, about what he wanted to say. He had also been thinking, for most of the afternoon, about how to say it in a way that was calibrated and measured, and landed correctly, and didn't ask too much, or assume too much, or... He stopped. He'd spent 2 years in a marriage learning to manage what he said. He wasn't going to do that here. "I want to say something," he said. "And I'm going to do it badly, so I'm just telling you that up front." She looked at him, waiting. "These past few months," he started, "since you started the job, I keep thinking about what you said, things you said, the way I find myself wanting to tell you things. Real things. Not the version I'd usually tell someone." He looked at the canal. "I know the job is finished. I know that changes things. I don't know what the right thing is to do with this. I've been thinking about it since the kitchen was done, and I can't come up with a better way to say it than, I'd like to keep seeing you. Not because of the work. Because of you." He stopped. He'd made it worse, somehow, with the wall metaphor he'd started to introduce, and then abandoned halfway through. He'd also repeated the word, things, 4 times. Lieselot was quiet. The canal was quiet. The afternoon light was going. "I knew in week 3, she said. He turned. "Week 3? When you made the second coffee." She looked at him steadily. "Nobody makes a second coffee for a contractor they're indifferent to. You didn't say anything, you just made another one and left it there." He thought about that Tuesday morning in the first week. The way she hadn't touched the first coffee. The way he'd made another one anyway, without thinking about why. "I didn't even realize I'd done that," he said. "I know." She looked at the canal. "That's why I noticed." They took the train back to Rotterdam in the early evening. She had her project in Utrecht to finish. He had a presentation at work the following week. The practical parts of their lives were exactly what they'd been that morning when they'd met outside the museum. Unchanged, specific, real. But something had been said, plainly, by both of them. On the train he sat across from her, and she was reading something on her phone, and he looked out at the dark fields going past in the window, and felt a quiet that was actually quiet. The kind that has no shape. The settled kind. She came to the house for dinner the following Saturday. He had, all week, practiced cooking a proper meal. He'd followed a recipe. Actually followed it. Measured things. Didn't improvise at the parts where improvising was not the move. It was a Dutch dish, which he'd decided on without totally admitting to himself why. It was good. Actually good. She said so. He made her say it again. It's good, Matteo. Say it like you mean it. She gave him a look that said she was not going to say it again, but the corner of her mouth did the thing it did. After dinner, she walked around the kitchen the way she'd done on the last day of the job, running a hand along the counter, opening a cabinet, checking a hinge with the reflexive attention of someone who can't help it. He stood in the doorway and watched her. Everything holding? He asked. She tested a shelf, nodded, ran her hand along the corner joint in the alcove. Good wood lasts, she said. She turned and looked at him. You know what the hardest part of carpentry is? He shook his head. Knowing when it's finished. She looked at the room. Most people want to keep going. Add things. Adjust. Change what's already right. She looked back at him. The skill is knowing when to put the tools down. He looked at her. He looked at the kitchen she'd built. Is it finished? He asked. She thought about it. No, she said. I don't think so. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The kitchen was warm. The oak had that evening light in it she'd told him it would have. His coffee cups were on the shelf at the right height. Neither of them said it was finished. Neither of them had to.